This week in Math 278, we will cover Grade 6, the number system. There is a lot of different standards associated with the number system and a lot of different pieces of the puzzle. So based on the different topics, I've tried to touch on many things that we'll see. So here are the first pieces, and then we actually have another set of pieces as well. So brace yourself for the longevity, but I think it'll be all okay. We can think about dividing fractions using multiplication and visual models. Let's explore the connection between division and multiplication and make sense of fraction division situations. Write at least two different division and two multiplication equations to match the diagram. There are two copies of 2/3. So when I look at from 0 to 1, I see that there are broken into thirds, and this first part is 2/3 and this second part is 2/3. So two copies of 2/3 means that we multiply 2 times 2/3, which is the same as 4 1/3, which is the same as 1 and 1/3. Similarly, we can reverse this as 2/3 times 2, which is 4/3, which is 1 and 1/3. For division, we ask how many 2/3 can go into 4/3. So how many of these 2/3 goes into the total when I'm broken down into thirds? 4/3. So 4/3 divided by 2/3 gives us 2 pieces. We could also ask how many 2/3 can go into 1 and 1/3, which then breaks down to 4/3 divided by 2/3, which is what we had earlier. And also, if we have 4/3 and we break into two different groups, how many are in each group? And we see that there'd be 2/3. Similarly, along the lines, that same lines, 1 and 1/3 divided by 2 is 2/3 as well. Match each situation with the division equation, fill in the blanks, and draw a diagram. So Mrs. Huxtable split 15/8 pies left over from the bake sale into this many pieces. How many portions did she make? She made this many portions. Well, she cut them into 3/8, 3 copies of 1/8 pieces, and she was able to make 5 portions. Using a circle graph or a circle pie graph, I start with 15/8. So I need 2 circles since we have a whole pie and a portion of another pie. I cut my pies into eighths, and then I highlighted 15 of them. I can then see if I were to subdivide them into or group them into groups of 3 copies of 1/8 that I'm able to make 5 complete portions. Situation B, Mrs. Huxtable split 15 copies of 1/8 pies, or 15 1/8 pie, left over from the bake sale between this many people. How much did each person get? Each person got this much of a pie. Well, since we can't have a fraction of a person, we must have 5 people, and each person must have gotten 3/8 of a pie. So again, I have my 15 1/8 pies, and this time I'm going to partition them off into 5 people. So I'm going to label 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. And then I can see that if I were to group all the 1s, all the 2s, all the 3s, all the 4s, and all the 5s together, each person would get 3/8 of the pie. Homework, write a story that matches each of the equations. Then use a number line or picture to show how the equations work. Scan and upload your documents to the Story Equations discussion board. Take a moment to view the strategies your classmates have submitted. We can use common denominators to divide fractions. This may be a new technique for some of you. Write each equation as a division expression and evaluate. Let's start with how many 2/5 are in 3. So the division equation is 3 divided by 2/5. So on my top line, I have 2/5. On my bottom line, I have 3. I want to know how many 2/5 can fit into 3. So if I were to count them, there would be 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, and then 1/5 here left over, and 1/5 is half of 2/5. So that would give me 7 1/2. Now, what we also could do is turn that 3 into 15/5. If I were to split my 3 into fifths, we'd have 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, 10, 11, 12, 13, 14, 15. Okay, and I'm splitting 15/5 divided by 2/5. Notice how I'm taking my numerators and that becomes my division. So 15/5 divided by 2/5 is the same as 15 over 2, which is 7 1/2. So we're splitting the total 15 into groups of 2, and we're able to get 7 groups of 2 with 1/2 left over. How many 2/5 are in 3/5, which the division is 3/5 divided by 2/5. So I want to know how many 2/5 can fit into 3/5. I can see that 2/5 can go in there one time with 1 out of the 2 left over. Similarly, I'm going to take 3 and split it into sections of 2. I'm going to take 3, split it into sections of 2, which is the same as 1 1/2, which is what we did visually. How many 2/5 are in 3/10? So I have 3/10 divided by 2/5 is how many? I'm going to create a common denominator by splitting my fifths into tenths. So 3/10 is the same and 2/5 is the same as 4/10. So I want to know how many 4/10 can go into 3/10. Well, I don't have enough 3/10 here to fill this, but I see that these 3/10 fill in 3/4 of the way. So 3 divided by 4 is the solution. How many 2/5 are in 1/10? Our division problem is 1/10 divided by 2/5. We need to find a common denominator, so I'm going to split my fifths into tenths. 1/10 divided by 4/10 is the same as 1/10 divided by 2/5. I see that if I start with 1/10, I don't have enough 1/10 to fit all of my top 2/5 in, but this piece covers 1/4 of the original part. So 1/10 divided by 4/10 is 1/4. Notice I'm using my numerators when my denominators are the same as our solution. 1 thermos of hot chocolate uses 2/3 cup of cocoa powder. How many thermoses can Nellie make with 3 cups of cocoa powder? Solve the problem by drawing a picture. Explain how you can see the answer to the problem in your picture, and which of the following multiplication of division equations represents this situation. Solve the arithmetic problem you choose and verify that you get the same answer as your picture. So I've got my picture here. It shows 3 rectangles that each represent 1 cup of cocoa powder. So 1, 2, 3 cups of cocoa powder. Each cup is then divided into thirds, right? Thirds. Since one thermos requires 2/3 cup, 2/3 are shaded to show a single thermos of cocoa. There are 4 whole groups of 2/3 cup of cocoa and a half a group of 2/3 cups of cocoa shown in the picture. So I can create 4 whole cups. When I look at this leftover, it is half of my groups. So Nellie can make 4.5 thermoses of cocoa. Our equation is 3 cups divided into 2/3. How many is that? Using our common denominators, 3 is the same as 3 is the same as 9/3. I take my numerators and divide them. 9/2 is the same as 4 1/2. It requires 1/4 of a credit to play a video game for 1 minute. Emma has 7/8 credit. Can she play for more or less than 1 minute? Explain. How long can Emma play the video game with her 7/8 of a credit? Well, we're comparing 1/4 and 7/8. So the first thing we need to do is change that 1/4, which we know is the same as 2/8. So 1/4 is the same as 2/8 of a credit for 1 minute. Well, if Emma has 7/8 of a credit and it takes 2/8 of a credit for 1 minute, Emma has more than it takes to play the game for 1 minute, so she can play more than 1 minute at a time. We know the game requires 1/4 of a credit for 1 minute of playing time, so the whole entire bar line is 1 credit, and we're interested in about 1 minute, which is 1/4. We know that Emma, to have 1 credit, is listed in below an eighth, and she has 7. We want to know how many 1/4 can go into 7/8. I can create a common denominator by breaking my fourths into 2 pieces for each section. So 7/8 divided by 2/8 gives us 7/2, which is the same as 3 wholes and 1/2 left over. Mrs. Smith's cookie recipe uses 1 1/3 cups of flour. Mrs. Smith has 5 1/2 cups of flour. Does she have enough flour to make 5 batches of cookies? Let's identify the dividend, the divisor, the quotient, and the remainder. Write the division expression and find the quotient, and write the final solution in a sentence. Well, we ask ourselves how many 1 1/3 portions are in 5 1/2 cups of flour. So the dividend is 5 1/2 and the divisor is 1 1/3. 5 1/2 divided by 1 1/3 we have listed below. We do not have the same denominator, so I will break the thirds. Well, first I have 11/2, and then second I have 4 copies of 1/3. Now we'll break them into sixths. They're common denominators, giving me 33 1/6 of flour and 8 1/6 of portioning out. This gives me 33/8. So 8 can go into 33 4 1/8 time. So 4 1/8 is our quotient, and 1/8 is the remainder. Mr. Nelson, this should be Mrs. Smith. Mrs. Smith does not have enough flour to make 5 batches of cookies. She has enough flour. She has enough flour to make 4 batches with 1/8 of a portion left over.